The NBA just witnessed the first blockbuster trade of 2026, and combined with the most catastrophic injury crisis the league has ever seen, professional basketball is spiraling into absolute chaos. Trae Young, the three-time All-Star point guard who spent his entire 8-year career in Atlanta, was just traded to the Washington Wizards in a franchise-altering deal that sent shockwaves through the entire league just hours ago. But here's where this story becomes a full-blown disaster. Young's trade is happening in the middle of an injury epidemic so severe that nearly 50% of NBA stars are currently sidelined. Players are missing games at a record-breaking 10% higher rate than any season since 2005, and teams are on pace to rack up over $525 million in lost productivity this season. Jayson Tatum is out until at least March with a Jones fracture. Tyrese Haliburton suffered a devastating Achilles injury in Game 7 of the Finals and won't return until next season. VanVleet tore his ACL. Kyrie Irving hasn't played since late last season. Damian Lillard is missing the entire year. LeBron James, Stephen Curry, Ja Morant, Anthony Davis, and countless other superstars are dealing with injuries that are destroying team rosters and playoff hopes. And now, with Trae Young getting shipped to Washington in what might be the most telling trade about his actual value around the league, the NBA is facing a perfect storm of chaos that threatens to derail the entire 2025-26 season. This isn't just a story about one trade or one injury. This is about a league in crisis, and what we're about to reveal will shock you to your core. If you want to stay on top of every breaking development in this NBA chaos, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this situation is about to get even crazier. Let's start with the Trae Young bombshell that dropped just hours ago, because this trade reveals so much about where the NBA is headed and why one of the league's most talented offensive players suddenly became radioactive to 29 teams. According to Clutch Point's league sources, the Atlanta Hawks have officially agreed to trade Trae Young to the Washington Wizards in exchange for CJ McCollum and Kispert. No draft picks are involved in this three-player deal, which is absolutely stunning when you consider Young is a 27-year-old three-time All-Star who averages 25.2 points and 9.8 assists per game for his career. This should be a franchise-altering acquisition that costs Washington multiple first-round picks and young assets. Instead, it's a straight salary swap with two role players going back to Atlanta. Young, who has spent all 8 years of his career in Atlanta after being drafted 5th overall in 2018, will now embark on a new journey in Washington amid rising tensions between him and the Hawks organization. The noise surrounding Young's eventual departure grew louder during the first week of 2026, with Atlanta prioritizing their youthful core headlined by Jalen Johnson and Dyson Daniels, rather than building around their franchise point guard. But here's the part that should terrify every NBA general manager and send warning signals throughout the league. According to NBC Sports sources, there was not much of a market for Trae Young despite him being in his prime and putting up elite numbers. On the surface, you would think a lot of teams would be interested in a 27-year-old who averages over 25 points and nearly 10 assists per game. They weren't. Part of the hesitation is that the league is deep with good point guards, and not many teams are looking for one. The Spurs, who used to be linked to Young constantly, now have De'Aaron Fox and Dylan Harper and have no interest. The Sacramento Kings continue to signal they're not interested in trading for Young. The Brooklyn Nets aren't interested. The Houston Rockets aren't interested. For the teams that do need someone at the point, the challenges are Young's well-chronicled defensive shortcomings, his ball-dominant style and how that impacts team chemistry, and how those two items combine to put a ceiling on how good a team can be with him as the primary option. In other words, Trae Young, one of the most electrifying offensive players in basketball, has become so problematic from a team-building perspective that only one franchise in the entire NBA was willing to trade for him, and that franchise is the Washington Wizards, a team that's been tanking and should probably continue tanking, but is now taking on a $46 million player with a $49 million player option next season. The trade terms tell the full story of Young's diminished value around the league. Atlanta is receiving C.J. McCollum, a 34-year-old guard on an expiring contract who averaged 13.7 points this season, and Corey Kispert, a 26-year-old wing averaging 8.9 points per game. That's what Trae Young is worth in today's NBA. Two replacement-level players whose contracts expire soon, giving Atlanta cap flexibility but zero long-term assets. According to multiple reports, there were front offices around the league that felt Atlanta should have to send draft picks out with Young to get a team to take on that contract. Read that again. Some teams believe the Hawks should attach picks to their three-time All-Star point guard just to get someone to take him. The Hawks obviously didn't see it that way, but the fact that Washington didn't have to give up anything of real value, no first-round picks, no premium young players, nothing except expiring contracts and a rotational wing, speaks volumes about how the league views Young as a building block. He's not a franchise cornerstone anymore. He's a high-usage, defensively challenged guard with a massive contract who puts up great stats on bad teams but hasn't proven he can be the best player on a contender. ESPN's Shams Charania reported that Young had the Wizards as his preferred destination, which adds another layer to this story. Young wanted to go to Washington, a team that finished last season with a 27-55 record and is currently sitting near the bottom of the Eastern Conference. Why would a player in his prime want to go to one of the worst teams in the league? The answer is probably that Washington was the only team willing to trade for him, and Young understood that staying in Atlanta wasn't an option anymore. The relationship had deteriorated to the point where both sides wanted out, and Washington was the only escape hatch available. The Wizards get an exciting player to sell tickets, and they may have hopes of re-signing Young when he surely opts out of his player option following this season, though that seems optimistic given his track record and the lack of interest from contending teams. For Atlanta, they've cleared cap space with McCollum's expiring deal, and they can now fully commit to building around Jalen Johnson, their 23-year-old forward who's averaging 18.4 points and 10.1 rebounds, and Dyson Daniels, the defensive specialist they acquired from New Orleans.
But the Trae Young trade is just one piece of a much larger crisis that's threatening to derail the entire NBA season. And that crisis is the injury epidemic that has absolutely devastated rosters across the league. According to certified athletic trainer Jeff Stotts, who maintains the most comprehensive database of NBA injuries, players missed 10% more games last season than in any other year he's tracked since 2005, aside from the pandemic seasons. And here's the terrifying part. Through 4 weeks of the 2025-26 season, players are missing games at the exact same rate as last year's record frequency. This isn't getting better, it's staying constant at a historically high level. Stars in particular have struggled to stay on the floor, and the NBA's definition of a star is a player who has made an All-Star or All-NBA team in the past 3 seasons. Nearly half, 21 out of 45 of the league's stars are currently injured. That's 47% of elite players sidelined at the same time, creating a competitive imbalance that's making it almost impossible to predict outcomes or evaluate teams accurately. Let's go through the carnage position by position, because understanding the full scope of this disaster is critical to grasping just how broken the NBA is right now. At point guard, the position is absolutely decimated. Fred VanVleet, the Houston Rockets' veteran floor general, was diagnosed with a torn ACL late in the offseason, immediately derailing the team's championship hopes after they acquired Kevin Durant. VanVleet is one of the league's best two-way guards, and his absence forces Houston to rely heavily on rookie Reed Sheppard, who many doubt is ready for such a significant role. DeJounte Murray, the New Orleans Pelicans point guard, has been sidelined since late January 2025, with his absence being a key factor in the complete derailment of his previous campaign. The Pelicans acquired Jordan Poole in the offseason to take over the starting role, but Murray's injury has left the team without the defensive intensity and playmaking they desperately need. Damian Lillard, the Portland Trail Blazers' all-time leading scorer, is missing the entire 2025-26 season, despite the team bringing him back on a 3-year deal in the offseason. The Blazers parted ways with Anthony Simons, but acquired Drew Holiday to fill the void, though Holiday himself has been dealing with persistent calf injuries that have limited his availability. And then there's Tyrese Haliburton, whose injury might be the most devastating of all. Haliburton suffered an Achilles injury in Game 7 of the 2024-25 NBA Finals, and he's done until next season. According to NBA.com's comprehensive injury report, the Indiana Pacers were 3 quarters from a possible championship last June, and Haliburton's injury in the finals completely changed the franchise's trajectory. The report states it shows the value of Haliburton in the Pacers' ecosystem and the lack of value among a handful of role players who cannot seem to flourish without the star point guard. Andrew Nembhard has taken over the starting point guard job, while Bennedict Mathurin shifted to starting shooting guard, creating a massive increase in usage and opportunity for both players. But losing Haliburton for an entire season after coming so close to a championship is absolutely heartbreaking for Indiana, and it raises serious questions about whether they can maintain their competitiveness without their engine. At shooting guard and small forward, the injuries continue to mount. Kyrie Irving, the Dallas Mavericks superstar, has been out since late last season, giving the Mavs plenty of time to plan for his absence, but creating enormous uncertainty about their championship aspirations. The Mavericks acquired D'Angelo Russell to fill the void, but Russell is nowhere near Irving's level as a playmaker and scorer. The fact that Dallas is essentially writing off an entire season while waiting for Irving to return speaks to how catastrophic injuries have become. Jayson Tatum, the Boston Celtics franchise player and one of the league's top 5 talents, suffered a Jones fracture in his left foot during off-season workouts and won't return until late this season, maybe March or early April at the earliest. According to NBA.com, the most ambitious, best-case scenario for Tatum's return is late this season, but the struggling Celtics could be headed to the draft lottery by then. Boston prepared for this rough bridge year by waving the white flag before it started, parting ways with Jrue Holiday, Kristaps Porzingis, and Al Horford, essentially punting on the season and accepting a tank year. The Celtics, who had only missed the playoffs once since 2007, are now facing the very real possibility of a top 5 pick in the 2026 draft, all because their best player got hurt before the season even began. At the big men positions, injuries continue to decimate. Anthony Davis, the Los Angeles Lakers all-star center, has been dealing with persistent calf injuries that have limited his availability and effectiveness. Davis is one of multiple stars, including Jrue Holiday and Ja Morant, who have suffered from the exact same type of calf strain, leading to widespread speculation about whether there's something systemic about modern NBA training or playing styles that's causing this specific injury. LeBron James, who turned 40 years old this season, is nursing sciatica and had a delayed start to the campaign. In his absence, the Lakers have relied more heavily on Austin Reeves and Rui Hachimura, with Gabe Vincent and Marcus Smart seeing increased minutes. But a 40-year-old LeBron dealing with back issues is a terrifying proposition for a Lakers team that has championship aspirations. Miles Turner, the Indiana Pacers' starting center and one of the league's best shot blockers, is done for the season, adding to Indiana's misery alongside Haliburton's absence. Bennedict Mathurin has missed 11 games. Aaron Nesmith has been out for a month with a knee injury. Obi Toppin won't return until February after foot surgery. NBA.com's assessment is brutal, stating this season could be a write-off for Indiana, not that the Pacers have much choice according to the standings. The broader context of this injury epidemic is even more alarming when you look at the financial impact. According to the Washington Post's reporting from December, teams are on pace to rack up more than $525 million in lost productivity this season for their injured stars. That's over $500 million in salary being paid to players who can't take the court, creating massive competitive and financial imbalances across the league. Golden State Warriors coach Steve Kerr sparked a moment of introspection for the NBA when he said his team's medical staff believed modern basketball's fast pace and heavy mileage were contributing to this rash of injuries. After bemoaning the lack of practice and recovery time, Kerr was asked whether he thought the league would consider shortening its 82-game schedule in an attempt to protect player health. He demurred, acknowledging that the financial realities of the NBA make schedule reduction almost impossible, despite the clear evidence that players' bodies are breaking down under the current workload.
This raises fundamental questions about the sustainability of the modern NBA. The game is faster than it's ever been, with teams averaging more possessions and more three-point attempts than at any point in history. Players are being asked to sprint up and down the court for 48 minutes, while also handling enormous defensive responsibilities in switching schemes that require elite athletes to guard multiple positions. The season is 82 games long, plus preseason, plus potentially 4 rounds of playoffs, meaning star players can play over 100 games in a single season if their team makes a deep run. And all of this is happening with less practice time than ever before due to scheduling constraints and player rest demands. The human body, even the elite athletic specimens that populate NBA rosters, isn't designed to handle this kind of sustained punishment. Something has to give, and what's giving is player health. The competitive implications of this injury crisis are staggering and impossible to ignore. Teams that have stayed relatively healthy, like the Oklahoma City Thunder and Cleveland Cavaliers, are dominating the standings despite not necessarily having the most talented rosters on paper. Meanwhile, teams with championship aspirations, like the Celtics, Pacers, Lakers, and Mavericks, are struggling to stay afloat while waiting for their stars to return. This creates a situation where the regular season becomes almost meaningless for evaluating team quality because we have no idea what these rosters actually look like when healthy. The Boston Celtics could finish with the worst record in the Eastern Conference and still potentially be a finals contender if Jayson Tatum returns healthy in April for the playoffs. The Indiana Pacers are essentially writing off an entire year despite being 3/4 away from a championship last June, all because Tyrese Haliburton got hurt at the worst possible moment. The competitive balance of the league has been completely destroyed by injuries, and there's no clear solution on the horizon. And now, with the Trae Young trade happening in the middle of all this chaos, we're seeing the secondary effects of the injury crisis on player movement and team building. The Wizards, who should be tanking and positioning themselves for Cooper Flagg or another top pick in the 2026 draft, instead traded for Trae Young in a move that will almost certainly cost them lottery positioning. Why would they do this? Because ownership wants to sell tickets, wants to create excitement, wants to give fans something to care about, even if it's counterproductive to long-term success. The NBA has become so star-driven that teams feel pressure to make splashy moves, even when those moves don't make basketball sense. Young will probably get Washington a few more wins, moving them out of the top 5 in the lottery odds, while not actually making them competitive for the playoffs. It's the worst of both worlds. Too good to get a franchise-changing draft pick, not good enough to contend, stuck in NBA purgatory. For Atlanta, moving on from Trae Young represents a philosophical shift in how they're approaching team building. Jalen Johnson and Dyson Daniels are both excellent young players, but neither projects as a true franchise centerpiece in the way that Young was supposed to be. By trading their best player for expiring contracts and cap flexibility, the Hawks are essentially betting that they can build a more balanced, defensively sound team without a ball-dominant star. It's the anti-superstar model. The idea that a team of good players might be better than a team with one great player and a bunch of role players. We've seen this work before with teams like the 2004 Detroit Pistons, who won a championship without a traditional superstar by playing elite defense and sharing the ball. But we've also seen it fail countless times because the modern NBA is designed to reward teams that have transcendent offensive creators who can break down defenses in playoff situations. The Hawks are betting on the former, that they can build something sustainable without Trae Young, but history suggests they might be making a massive mistake. The broader implications of this injury epidemic and the Trae Young trade chaos extend to how the league markets itself and generates revenue. The NBA has built its brand around individual stars. LeBron, Curry, Giannis, Luka, these are the faces that casual fans recognize and pay to see. When half of those stars are injured at any given time, it becomes almost impossible to market games effectively. National television ratings have already been declining, and injuries are a major factor. Fans tune in to watch specific players, and when those players are unavailable, viewership drops significantly.
This creates a vicious cycle where lower ratings lead to less revenue, which leads to pressure on teams to make short-term decisions, like the Wizards' Trae Young trade, which further damages long-term competitiveness, which leads to more bad basketball and lower ratings. The league is trapped in a downward spiral, and the injury epidemic is accelerating that spiral to a dangerous degree. The player empowerment era, which has been the defining characteristic of the NBA over the past decade, is also being challenged by this injury crisis. Players have more control over their careers than ever before, demanding trades, forcing their way to preferred destinations, signing shorter contracts to maintain flexibility. But when those players are constantly injured, their leverage diminishes significantly. Trae Young wanted to go to Washington, and Washington was the only team willing to take him despite being a three-time All-Star in his prime. That's a stunning indictment of how the league views his value. If Young were completely healthy and performing at his peak, he'd have multiple suitors offering significant packages. Instead, he's being treated like a salary dump, a problematic contract that teams are hesitant to take on, even with his obvious talent. This dynamic is going to impact how future negotiations play out, with teams becoming more conservative in their willingness to meet player demands when there's always the risk of a catastrophic injury derailing everything.
The coaching implications of this injury epidemic are equally significant and often overlooked. Coaches are being asked to prepare game plans and rotations for rosters that change weekly based on injury reports. They can't build continuity or chemistry when lineups are constantly shifting. Player development becomes almost impossible when young players are being thrust into roles they're not ready for because veterans are injured. Defensive schemes that rely on specific personnel break down when those personnel aren't available. Offensive systems that are built around a star player's skills have to be completely redesigned on the fly. Coaching has always been about adaptation, but what we're seeing now is beyond normal adaptation. It's chaos management, trying to keep teams competitive with rosters that bear no resemblance to what was planned in training camp. The best coaches are those who can navigate this chaos, but even the best coaches can't overcome the sheer volume of injuries we're seeing this season. The draft and player development pipelines are also being impacted in ways that won't be fully understood for years. Teams that are tanking because of injuries, like the Celtics, are going to get high draft picks that they wouldn't have earned if their stars were healthy. This creates a situation where a team like Boston could end up with Cooper Flagg or another generational prospect simply because Jayson Tatum got hurt in the offseason. Meanwhile, teams that have stayed healthy but don't have elite talent will miss out on top picks despite not being fundamentally better organizations. The draft lottery is supposed to reward the worst teams and give them a chance to improve, but when injuries are determining which teams are worst, the entire system breaks down. We could see dynasties built not on smart management or player development, but on lucky timing, where a star gets hurt, the team tanks for a year, lands a top pick, and then becomes dominant when everyone's healthy. That's not how competitive balance is supposed to work. The international implications of this injury crisis are also worth considering, because the NBA is a global league with players from dozens of countries participating in international competitions during the summer. The Olympics, World Cup, Eurobasket, and other tournaments create additional wear and tear on players' bodies, and many teams are starting to push back against allowing their stars to participate. This creates tension between NBA franchises who pay players' salaries and want to protect their investments, and national federations who want their best players representing their countries. We're heading toward a breaking point where something has to give. Either international competitions will have to be reduced or redesigned, or NBA teams will have to accept that their players will be at higher injury risk, or players will have to make difficult choices about what they prioritize. None of those options are appealing, and the NBA's injury epidemic is forcing these conversations much sooner than anyone anticipated. The gambling implications of this injury epidemic are also creating concerns among league officials and sports betting operators.
The NBA has embraced sports betting as a major revenue source, partnering with multiple sports books and integrating betting lines and odds into broadcasts. But when half of the league's stars are injured at any given time, it becomes almost impossible to set accurate lines or predict outcomes. Games swing wildly based on last-minute injury reports, creating opportunities for exploitation by informed bettors who have access to injury information before it becomes public. The integrity of betting markets relies on predictability and transparency, and the injury epidemic is undermining both. We're seeing more games postponed or played with significantly altered lineups, and betting operators are struggling to adjust their models accordingly. This could lead to regulatory scrutiny and potential restrictions on NBA betting if the problem continues to worsen. The Trae Young trade happening in the middle of all this chaos feels almost symbolic of where the NBA is headed. A talented player who should be a franchise cornerstone gets devalued to the point where only one team is willing to trade for him, and that team is making the move for ticket sales rather than basketball reasons. Meanwhile, half the league's stars are injured, teams are losing over $500 million in productivity, coaches are struggling to keep rosters competitive, and the entire structure of the league is being challenged by a problem that nobody seems able to solve. Steve Kerr suggested shortening the schedule, but acknowledged it probably won't happen due to financial pressures. Load management, where teams rest healthy players to prevent injuries, has been criticized and restricted by the league. There are no easy answers, and the injury epidemic is exposing fundamental flaws in how the modern NBA operates. Looking ahead to the rest of the 2025-26 season, the chaos is only going to intensify. The trade deadline is February 5th, less than a month away, and teams are trying to figure out whether to buy, sell, or stand pat while dealing with constantly shifting injury reports. Jonathan Kuminga becomes trade eligible on January 15th, and the Warriors are expected to move him, along with other pieces, as they retool around Stephen Curry, who himself is dealing with quadriceps issues that have limited his availability. Giannis Antetokounmpo, Anthony Davis, and Domantas Sabonis are all names being mentioned in trade rumors, though any deals involving stars of that caliber will be complicated by injury concerns. Teams that have stayed healthy but don't have elite talent will miss out on top picks despite not being fundamentally better organizations. Teams that were planning to tank might end up making the playoffs if other teams' stars stay injured longer than expected. Nothing is stable, nothing is predictable, and the league is lurching from one crisis to another with no clear path forward. The player reactions to this injury epidemic have been mixed, with some superstars speaking out about the need for schedule changes or rule modifications, while others have stayed silent and focused on their own recovery. There's a growing sense among players that something needs to change, but there's no consensus on what that change should look like. Shortening the schedule would mean less revenue, which would impact salary cap calculations and max contracts. Adding more rest days between games would extend the season further into summer, conflicting with international competitions and free agency timelines. Reducing the intensity of play by changing rules would fundamentally alter the product on the floor. Every potential solution creates new problems, and the Players Association is struggling to find common ground among its members about what priorities should drive negotiations.
The media coverage of this injury epidemic has been extensive, with every major outlet publishing think pieces about what's causing the problem and how to fix it. But despite all the analysis and debate, we're no closer to solutions than we were 6 months ago. The Washington Post's report about the $525 million price tag generated headlines but didn't lead to any concrete action from the league office. Steve Kerr's comments about pace and mileage sparked discussion but didn't result in any rule changes or schedule modifications. The injury reports continue to grow longer every week, and teams continue to adapt as best they can while hoping their stars stay healthy long enough to make a playoff run. It's a reactive strategy rather than a proactive one, and history suggests that reactive strategies rarely solve systemic problems. The Trae Young trade to Washington will be remembered as one of the most telling transactions of the 2025-26 season, not because of what it accomplished for either team, but because of what it revealed about player value in the modern NBA. A three-time All-Star in his prime who averages over 25 points and nearly 10 assists per game couldn't generate interest from more than one team, and that one team didn't have to give up any real assets to acquire him. Young's defensive limitations and ball-dominant playing style have become so problematic in the eyes of front offices that his offensive brilliance is no longer enough to overcome those concerns. This represents a fundamental shift in how teams evaluate talent, moving away from pure statistical production toward a more holistic assessment of how a player impacts winning. Whether that shift is correct remains to be seen, but it's clear that the old model of building around high-usage offensive creators is falling out of favor in an era where defense and ball movement are increasingly valued. For the Washington Wizards, the Trae Young acquisition is a gamble that could define the franchise's direction for the next decade. If Young can somehow make them competitive while fitting into a more balanced offensive system, and if they can re-sign him when his player option expires, this trade could look brilliant in hindsight. But if Young continues to struggle defensively, if he can't coexist with the young players Washington has been developing, if he opts out and signs elsewhere after one mediocre season, this trade will be remembered as a massive mistake that cost the Wizards a chance to draft Cooper Flagg or another generational talent. The fact that they made this move in the middle of an injury epidemic, when the smart play would be to maximize their lottery odds and build for the future, suggests this was driven more by ownership's desire for headlines than by sound basketball strategy. For the Atlanta Hawks, the moving on from Trae Young represents the end of an era and the beginning of something uncertain. They've cleared cap space and positioned themselves to build around younger players who might develop into something special, but they've also given up on the one proven star on their roster without receiving any long-term assets in return. Jalen Johnson and Dyson Daniels are promising talents, but neither has shown they can be the best player on a contending team. The Hawks are betting that a balanced roster without a clear hierarchy is better than a top-heavy roster built around a flawed superstar, but that debt could easily backfire if Johnson and Daniels don't make significant developmental leaps. Atlanta has essentially reset their timeline, pushing contention down the road by at least 3 or 4 years, and there's no guarantee they'll be any better positioned at the end of that timeline than they are right now. The NBA is in chaos, plain and simple. Nearly half of the league's stars are injured, creating an unprecedented competitive imbalance. Players are missing games at a record rate, costing teams over $500 million in lost productivity. Trae Young, a 3-time All-Star in his prime, just got traded for role players because only one team in the entire league was willing to take him on. The trade deadline is approaching with more uncertainty than ever before about which teams should buy and which should sell. International competitions are creating additional injury risks that teams are increasingly pushing back against. Gambling markets are struggling to account for the unpredictability created by constant injuries. The financial model of the league is being challenged by the need for deeper rosters and more conservative contract structures. And nobody, not the league office, not the Players Association, not coaches or trainers or medical staff, has a clear solution to the problems that are threatening the sustainability of professional basketball. This story is based on reports from Clutch Points, ESPN's Shams Charania, NBC Sports, The Washington Post, NBA.com, Sportico, CBS Sports, and other major NBA media outlets. All information regarding the Trae Young trade, injury reports, and league-wide statistics is accurate as of January 8, 2026. The NBA's injury situation remains fluid and subject to constant change as new injuries occur and players return from existing ailments.